She bought a stranger for $1 to survive the winter. He said her name like he already knew her soul. Alone, pregnant, and with 2 children to protect, she never expected what came next. The town was barely that. 3 buildings, a sagging church with no bell, and a saloon that doubled as a boarding house and tripled as a place no decent woman should linger near. The wind came through like it meant to scrape flesh from bone, carrying dust and the promise of snow too early in the season. Maribeth Greeley kept her hands tucked into the folds of her threadbare shawl, her belly swollen under the fabric, her back aching from the miles behind her and the silence that always grew heavier when she neared men. 2 children flanked her, their cheeks pink from cold, their eyes darting at shadows. Joanna, barely 8, held her younger brother's hand like she was already old. Matthew was 5 and hadn't spoken in 3 days. They left Kansas 2 weeks before the frost came in. Left because her husband had died on the wrong end of a banker's rifle, and because the preacher in town had said it was improper for a woman alone to keep farming land that was no longer legally hers. Improper. Like grief had a code of conduct. She hitched a ride as far as the cattleman's route would take her, then walked the rest, relying on kindness that came with strings or not at all. But this town, God help her, this town had one thing no other place dared offer: a man for sale. It wasn't slavery, not really. That had died with the war. This was different. A notice had gone up weeks prior, nailed to a post like scripture in splinters: Man of the mountain seeks lawful employment, willing to trade service for shelter through winter. $1 contract, terms negotiable, no questions asked. Most folks in town had laughed. Said if a man couldn't earn his keep the hard way, he wasn't worth the firewood he'd split. But Maribeth saw it for what it was, an answer. Not just to her hunger or her children's shivering frames, but to the unbearable silence that crept closer each day. A man in the house meant protection, meant maybe they'd make it through to spring. The deal was struck without ceremony. $1 folded handed to a man who looked more bare than human. Broad shoulders under a wool coat worn smooth in places, a beard thick and black, eyes gray and unreadable beneath the brim of a slouch hat. He didn't speak much. Didn't smile either, just looked at her, at the children, and nodded once. "What's your name?" she asked as they loaded her few belongings into a borrowed wagon, one wheel cracked, one child coughing. The man paused, then said, "Reckon you'll know it soon enough." They left the town behind before dusk, the road winding between brittle trees and forgotten fences. The silence between them wasn't tense, it was weighty, like something waiting to drop. The wagon creaked beneath them, and the mountain rose in the distance like the back of some sleeping beast. It was cold enough to make breath steam and fingers numb, but still Maribeth didn't speak again. She was saving her words, saving everything. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridge, they arrived at the cabin. It was bigger than she expected: 2 rooms, a loft, smoke already trailing from the chimney. Whoever he was, he hadn't lied about having shelter. He helped her down without touching her, his movements careful, deliberate. Inside, the cabin was sparse but warm. A fire crackled low, and the smell of stew lingered in the air like memory. He showed her the cot, the hearth, the shelf of canned goods. He didn't explain anything. He didn't need to. The children fell asleep almost instantly, curled together beneath quilts she didn't recognize. Maribeth sat near the fire, staring at the flames until her belly shifted and reminded her what she carried. He spoke then from the shadows. "You're too thin for a woman that far along." She didn't jump, just nodded. "Been walking too long." "You got a plan for the birth?" "No," her voice cracked. "Do you?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "A midwife's a week south. Snow comes early, you won't reach her." Maribeth met his eyes, and for the first time something moved in them. Not pity, not desire, recognition maybe. She said nothing more, and neither did he. That night she lay awake long after the fire dimmed, listening to the wind whistle through cracks in the logs and the steady breathing of the man who had no name. She wondered if she'd made a mistake, if a woman alone could ever afford to trust. But trust wasn't what this was. This was survival. In the morning she found him outside splitting wood, his breath misting in the cold. The children were still asleep. She stood on the porch watching him, her shawl wrapped tight. When he saw her, he didn't stop, just spoke between strikes. "You got a strong back for someone carrying 3." She didn't correct him. The baby counted, even if it wasn't walking yet. "You got a name?" he asked after a moment. "Maribeth." He froze, axe mid-swing. His eyes met hers, sharp and suddenly awake. "Maribeth Greeley." She felt the blood drain from her face. "How do you know that?" He lowered the axe slowly, not answering right away. Then, quiet as the snow settling around them, he said, "Because you prayed my name once, and I heard it." She staggered back a step, hand flying to her belly as if to shield herself. He didn't move, didn't explain, but his face held something she hadn't seen in a long, long time: certainty. Inside, the children stirred. Outside, the sky darkened with snow again. Maribeth didn't speak, not right away. She stood frozen on the edge of the porch, breath shallow, eyes locked on the man who just unraveled her name from his lips like he'd carried it for years. Her mind scrambled through memory, faces, voices, names. But it wasn't there. He wasn't there. And yet something in the way he said it made her knees weaken and her stomach turn, not with fear, but with a strange, echoing familiarity that struck deep. He didn't press her, didn't look away either. Just turned back to the chopping block, drove the axe down once more, splitting a thick log with a clean crack that broke the silence like a bone. Inside, the children were stirring. She heard Matthew's sleepy whimper and Joanna's soft hush in response. Maribeth blinked and pulled herself together, stepping back into the cabin and closing the door behind her. The warmth inside felt thinner than it had the night before, or maybe it was just her nerves unraveling. Joanna rubbed her eyes, hair a tangle of straw and sleep. "Mama, where are we?" Maribeth knelt and pulled both children close. "Somewhere safe," she whispered, though the words didn't sit right in her mouth. They were true, maybe, or maybe just hopeful. Later, while the children sat near the fire eating from chipped bowls filled with watered-down stew, Maribeth stood at the window watching him. He moved like the mountain itself, silent, immovable, necessary. But now her eyes traced the details she'd missed in the urgency of cold and need. The old scar on his knuckles, the way he looked toward the ridge every time the wind shifted, like he expected something or someone to come over it. When he finally returned, arms full of split wood, she stepped aside without a word. He stacked the pieces near the hearth, brushed snow from his shoulders, and sat at the small table like it was a chore he'd been avoiding. Maribeth ladled the last of the stew into a bowl and set it before him. He ate without looking up, hands steady, movements slow. "You said I prayed your name," she said low. He swallowed, set the spoon down, and looked at her. "You did." "I don't remember." "You were 17, behind a burned-out chapel outside Ellensburg. You were bleeding." She felt the air vanish from her lungs. Her hand found the edge of the table to steady herself. "That was," she started, then stopped. She hadn't spoken of that night in 10 years, not to anyone. She thought it had died with the old timber walls and the man who'd run off and left her there. "I wasn't there by accident," he said. "I found you. You don't remember me because I didn't let you." She stared at him, heart thundering. "Why?" "Because I was running too." There it was, no dramatics, no explanation. Just that simple sentence, and suddenly her knees couldn't hold her. She sank onto the bench across from him, eyes burning. "You left me," she said. "It wasn't accusation, just a fact." "I saved you," he answered, and there was something hard in his voice now. "Carried you to the widow Haynes' farm, told her you needed a doctor, and then I left." "Why?" He looked past her then, toward the flames. "Because I wasn't ready to be seen." Silence stretched between them like a fault line, deep and full of things neither of them could name. The children were still eating, oblivious to the tension unraveling like old twine. She couldn't reconcile it, the memory of pain and fire and blood, the desperate prayer she'd whispered into the ashes, and the man before her now. But something in his eyes made her believe it. He wasn't lying. That part she knew in her bones. "What's your name?" she asked. His gaze met hers. "Clay Maddox." It hit her like a thunderclap. She hadn't heard that name in over a decade. She knew it from the stories. The outlaw who vanished after a gunfight gone wrong, the man some said had robbed a train, and others swore had saved a dozen children from a fire in Texas. No one ever knew what parts were true. And yet here he was, building fires and chopping wood like redemption could be earned one splinter at a time. "You shouldn't have told me," she said, voice barely a whisper. "I know." She wanted to be angry, wanted to demand why he'd waited, why he hadn't spoken sooner. But all she could feel was the press of time, the weight of years between them, and the way her unborn child turned in her belly like it too could feel the shift in the room. That night she couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up again, and the old cabin creaked like it was remembering storms of years past. She lay on her side, back aching, one hand resting on her stomach. Across the room, Clay sat near the dying fire, carving something from a block of wood. The scraping sound was slow and even, calming in a way, like the ticking of a clock that had never stopped for either of them. "You said you were running," she said into the dark. "I was." "From what?" He paused, the carving knife stilled. "Myself," he said, "and from what I did." She didn't press. She knew what it meant to carry shame too heavy for words. Instead, she turned her face toward the wall and let the sound of his knife lull her toward sleep. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Clay chopped wood, hunted what game he could find, and stayed quiet. The children began to soften toward him. Joanna asked him about the trees, about the best way to trap rabbits. Matthew followed him around in silence, mimicking his steps. Clay never pushed, never raised his voice. But slowly, without her even noticing, the cabin began to feel more like a home. Maribeth washed clothes in melted snow, cooked meals from whatever Clay brought in, and tried not to think about the past. But every now and then, she'd catch him watching her. Not in the way men used to watch when they thought they had a right, but like he was trying to remember something he hadn't quite lost. One night, when the fire was low and the children already asleep, he spoke. "I didn't know it was you," he said, "not when I put up the notice." She looked up from her mending. "But you remembered." "Only after you said your name." She nodded slowly. "Why did you leave again after saving me?" His hands tightened around the carving. "Because I was half a man back then. I thought if I stayed, I'd ruin you. And now, I ain't sure what I am now, but I know I wouldn't leave again." There it was, a promise he hadn't spoken before, a thread woven quiet between them. But fate has a way of listening in when you start to believe in peace. It happened 2 mornings later. Clay had gone to check the trap line. Maribeth was pulling blankets from the loft when the dog barked, a sharp, frantic sound that made her blood run cold. She ran to the window, heart pounding. Riders, 3 of them, cresting the ridge like shadows on horseback. Her breath caught. They weren't townsmen, weren't drifters. These men wore purpose like armor, and one of them, Lord help her, had a face she recognized. Clay returned minutes later, rifle in hand, eyes already hard. "You know them?" he asked. She nodded, voice dry. "The tall one's Emmett Case. He rode with the man who killed my husband." Clay's jaw clenched. "They here for you or me?" she asked. "Both," he said without hesitation. The children were behind her, silent, wide-eyed. She looked at Clay, really looked, and for the first time fear didn't curl in her chest. Not because the danger wasn't real, but because for the first time she didn't feel alone. The riders didn't charge. They circled the ridge like buzzards waiting for death to do its work. Their silhouettes cut against the pale sky, dark and still, horses restless beneath them. From inside the cabin, Maribeth could just make out the glint of a long rifle slung across the back of the tallest one, Emmett Case. He hadn't changed much since the last time she saw him through the smoke of her burning barn and the wreckage of a life he helped ruin. His presence alone turned her stomach, not out of fear, but fury. The kind that sleeps deep until it's stirred by something sharp and unwelcome. Clay stood near the window, quiet as always, calculating. He didn't pace, didn't fidget. He simply watched. Joanna clung to her mother's skirt, while Matthew stayed behind the table, fists clenched at his sides. Maribeth could feel the air thickening, danger curling slow and patient around the corners of the cabin like fog. "What do we do?" she asked, voice low. Clay's answer was simple: wait. It didn't seem like much of a plan, but something in his calm steadied her. He knew something she didn't, or maybe he just didn't rattle easy. Either way, she trusted it, trusted him. They spent the next hour in tense silence, preparing as best they could. Clay loaded his rifle, checked the revolver under the floorboard, and handed her a shotgun older than she was. He didn't ask if she knew how to use it. She didn't need to tell him she did. "I can take the children to the crawl space under the root cellar," she said, watching his eyes. He nodded. "Only if they start shooting. Otherwise we keep them where we can see them." Joanna's hand slipped into Maribeth's, small and trembling. "Are they bad men, Mama?" She didn't lie. "Yes." Clay glanced at the door again. "They ain't gonna shoot first. Men like that want you afraid before they want you dead." "How do you know?" He met her gaze, and for the first time since he'd said her name on the porch, Maribeth saw a flicker of something in him that chilled her, a shadow of who he'd been. "Because I used to ride with men like that." She should have felt something bitter in that truth, but she didn't. Because whatever he was then, he wasn't now. And the man standing between her and those riders wasn't someone who'd run from blood anymore. It was near sunset when the knock came. Not urgent, not violent, just 3 dull thuds like a formality, like a man too arrogant to think he might be denied. Clay opened the door slow, rifle in hand. Maribeth stood just behind him, shotgun lowered but ready. Emmett Case stood on the stoop, dust clinging to his coat, eyes gleaming with the kind of confidence that comes from never losing. "Well," Emmett drawled, glancing past Clay at Maribeth, "ain't this a reunion?" She didn't speak, neither did Clay. Emmett shifted his weight, gloved hand resting casually on his hip near the butt of his revolver. "We came up from Fort Nelson." Heard tell there was a woman out here with a couple of kids and something valuable in tow. Don't see any valuables, Clay replied, voice flat. Oh, I disagree, Emmett said, smiling now. See, that woman's husband owed us. Died too quick to pay, but debt don't die just 'cause the man did. And now we hear she's been keeping company with a ghost. Clay's grip on the rifle didn't change, but the air in the cabin shifted. Heavy, electric. You're not taking her, he said. Emmett chuckled. We ain't here to take nobody, just here to collect. Maribeth stepped forward, eyes hard. You got nothing I owe. That baby in your belly says different, Emmett said. The breath hitched in her chest. Clay raised the rifle slightly. You'll leave now. Emmett held his ground, still smiling. You gonna kill a man in front of a lady and her kids? If you make me, Clay said, cold as iron. A long silence stretched between them. Then Emmett tipped his hat and stepped back. We'll give you the night, think things over. Come morning we come back for what's owed. He turned, whistled, and the other two men followed him down the path, horses clattering on stone and ice. The moment they disappeared beyond the tree line, Clay shut the door and bolted it. Maribeth felt the weight return to her lungs. They won't wait till morning. No, Clay said, they won't. He moved quickly then. Set the children in the far room with food and strict instructions not to come out unless they heard his voice. He built up the fire, loaded every weapon twice over, and set up a line of small bells on a thread strung across the tree line outside. You've done this before, she said, watching his hands. Too many times. Why are they really here? They want to see me crawl, he answered, and they think hurting you is how they get that. Maribeth swallowed her rising fear. Why? He finally looked at her, and the truth was quiet but devastating. Because once I did the same to someone else. She didn't ask for the story, didn't need to. The way he carried it was all the story she required. Whatever Clay Maddox had done, he'd been carrying it long before she met him, and now somehow it was coming back around. That night they didn't sleep. She sat near the hearth, shotgun on her knees, staring at the fire. Clay moved between windows like a sentinel. When the children finally drifted into sleep, he came to sit beside her, eyes hollow with exhaustion. I left because I thought you'd be better without a man like me, he said suddenly. But I never stopped thinking about you. Every step I took, I heard your voice. She looked at him, at the hard lines of his face softened now by the firelight and confession. You saved me. That counts for something. His eyes glinted. I aim to do it again. Before she could answer, a sound broke the still, soft but clear. Metal striking metal, one of the bells. Clay rose in an instant, rifle ready. Maribeth moved with him, heart in her throat. Another bell, then a third. They're here, Clay said. They braced for it, but the first shot didn't come through the window. It came from the trees, high and sharp, a warning shot that buried into the porch post. Clay opened the door just a crack, peered out, and then slammed it shut again. They've got torches, he said. A second shot hit the side of the cabin, sending a puff of wood dust into the air. Maribeth pulled Joanna and Matthew from the back room and shoved them into the crawl space under the floorboards. Joanna clutched her doll. Matthew didn't cry. He was too scared to cry. The front window shattered. Clay returned fire, clean and fast, driving one man behind the barn. Maribeth watched the back window, finger on the trigger. They're trying to smoke us out, he muttered, eyes scanning the shadows. They want to burn us. She didn't ask what came next. She knew. It would be fast or it would be slow, but either way it would be fire and blood if they stayed huddled here like sheep. Clay seemed to come to the same conclusion. "I'll draw them out," he said. "Take the back path down the creek. If I lead them wide, you can get the children south." Maribeth shook her head. "No, no, I'm not leaving without you." He stepped close, pressed a hand to her face. "You don't owe me anything, Maribeth." She grabbed his wrist. "I'm not staying alive just to survive anymore. Not again." His eyes closed, jaw clenched. Then he nodded. "Then we finish this." The last attack came at once. All three men tried to rush the door together, figuring their numbers would overwhelm him. They figured wrong. Clay stepped out first, his rifle roaring. One man went down, screaming. Maribeth fired from the window, catching another in the thigh. Emmett made it to the porch before Clay tackled him to the ground, fists flying. The fight was brutal, fast, nothing graceful. Two men who had lived too hard for too long, now trying to end the other before breath gave out. In the end, it was Maribeth who stopped it. Emmett reached for his revolver. She stepped from the cabin, shotgun in hand, and leveled it at his chest. "Don't," she said. He paused, eyes on hers. Then something shifted in his face, not fear, understanding. "You were always stronger than him," he said. Then Clay hit him once more, and the fight was over. They buried the bodies at sunrise. Clay dug the graves in silence. Maribeth didn't speak either, just stood by with the children, her belly tight with aches and the weight of everything that had just passed. When it was done, they sat on the porch, watching the frost burn off the pines. "You gonna ask me to leave?" he said finally. She shook her head. "Not if you still mean what you said, about not leaving again." He looked at her then, and in his eyes was something she hadn't dared hope for since the day she'd buried her first husband, something solid, something safe. "I do," he said. She reached over and took his hand, and for the first time in years, it felt like spring might come after all. The days after the fight passed in a blur of ash, cold and silence broken only by the crack of wood splitting or the soft murmur of children's voices trying to reclaim what was left of peace. The bodies were long buried, the blood washed away with creek water and melted snow, but the weight of what happened lingered. Even in the warmth of the firelight or the faint smile that passed across Joanna's face when she helped stir stew, the ghosts of that night stayed close. Maribeth found herself watching Clay more than she meant to. He had changed in a way she hadn't expected, not broken or hardened, but steadied. He didn't speak of the fight. He didn't speak of Emmett or the man he'd been before, but the shift was there. He moved with quieter purpose now, and though he still woke before dawn and took to the woods before breakfast, he always came back. Always. And that alone began to change things inside her. The children, too, began to change. Matthew, once silent and watchful, started to speak again in soft bursts. He asked questions, pointed at birds, and began trailing after Clay the way boys do when they start seeing men not as strangers, but as something worth imitating. Joanna, ever serious, spent more time beside Maribeth, asking cautious, pointed questions about the baby and the road ahead. She didn't ask about her father, and Maribeth didn't offer. That chapter had ended in gunfire and smoke. They all had new pages to write now. One morning, after a night of hard frost and silence, Maribeth stood behind the cabin watching the sun rise slow over the distant ridge. Her hands rested on her belly, and she felt the baby shift, a flutter more than a kick. It drew a breath from her, a reminder that even in the cold, something warm and alive moved inside her still. "You feel it," Clay's voice came low behind her. She didn't turn, just nodded. "It's strong," he added after a beat. Too strong sometimes, she said. Feels like it's trying to fight its way out. You got a name. She smiled faintly. I've been thinking on that. Clay stepped up beside her, his coat brushing hers. I was born with a name I never liked much. Folks used it like a threat. Clay Maddox meant something different in every town and none of it good. She turned to look at him. That name saved me once. His eyes softened. It's gonna save you again. They didn't speak of the future much. The war between what could be and what had been was still too fresh. But something in their quiet moments began to bridge that gap, weaving safety into the hours in ways she hadn't felt since before Kansas turned its back on her. The snow came early that year. Heavy, dry flurries that blanketed the valley in white and muted the world into silence. Clay built the fire higher each night. Maribeth gathered what supplies remained and rationed them with care. The children helped with small chores, boots crunching in snow as they fetched firewood or brushed frost from the window panes. Then, on a bitter morning thick with low clouds and aching wind, the labor began. It came without warning. One moment Maribeth was shelling dried beans at the table, and the next her breath hitched and her body bent in half with a pain that clawed from her spine to her ribs. She gripped the table hard enough to make her knuckles pale. Joanna saw it first. Mama. Maribeth straightened slowly, breath coming fast. It's time, she whispered. Clay moved fast, quicker than she'd ever seen him. He cleared the table, threw extra logs on the fire, and ushered the children into the back room. Joanna protested at first, but Maribeth calmed her with a touch. It's all right, she said through gritted teeth. He'll take care of us. Clay helped her to the cot, his hands firm but gentle. She didn't cry out. She didn't have to. The storm of pain rising inside her was louder than any scream. The hours blurred. Time bent and cracked under the weight of each contraction. Clay never left her side. He kept the water hot, the fire steady, and her hand gripped tight in his. At one point the pain rolled over her so hard she wept, sobbing into the wool of his coat as he held her upright, whispering that she was strong, that she could do this, that he wasn't going anywhere. And then came the silence before the cry. A long pause, long enough to steal the breath from her chest, but then sharp and high like a call from heaven, the baby wailed. Clay laughed, actually laughed, a full, broken, joyful sound that split the weight of the night wide open. He wrapped the baby in cloth and placed her into Maribeth's arms. She's perfect, he said, voice raw. Maribeth stared at the child, dark hair, strong lungs, fists balled tight. She cried then, but not from pain, from awe, from release. She's got your eyes, she said. Clay knelt beside the cot, brushing damp hair from Maribeth's forehead. She's got your fire. They didn't name her that night. They didn't need to. The baby's presence filled the cabin like light. Joanna and Matthew crept out after the crying stopped, wide-eyed and breathless. Maribeth let them hold her one at a time, tears streaming down Joanna's cheeks as she whispered to her new sister. The next days were a strange kind of peace. The snow thickened, but it didn't feel cruel. The baby, whom they finally named Clara, slept more than she cried, her tiny chest rising and falling in rhythm with the fire's crackle. Maribeth moved slower, her body sore and bent, but each step she took was steadier. Clay hovered without hovering. He cooked, cleaned, chopped, fetched. He held Clara like he'd always known how, cradled her with the same care he used when handling a rifle, gentle but sure. Maribeth found herself watching him again, this time not from fear or confusion, but from something deeper, something harder to name. One night, when the children were asleep and Clara nestled between them, she sat beside Clay at the table, the lamp flickering soft between them. "You could have left," she said. "After the fight, after the baby." "I could have," he agreed. "But you didn't." He met her gaze. "I've been running so long I forgot what it felt like to stop. Then I found you." Maribeth blinked back the warmth behind her eyes. "You saved me twice now." Clay shook his head. "No, you saved me this time." Silence stretched between them, comfortable now, familiar. She reached across the table, fingers brushing his. He didn't flinch. Instead, he turned his hand palm up and let her lace her fingers through his. The winter stretched on. The snow piled higher than the window sills. Food ran thinner but never out. They rationed, planned, worked together. Maribeth grew stronger. Clay repaired a broken sled and fashioned new boots for the children from leftover hide. There was no promise of spring, not yet, but there was warmth in the way they moved together, spoke without speaking, leaned toward each other without thought. One night, as the wind howled against the cabin and the fire glowed low, Maribeth stirred awake to the sound of Clay humming, a soft, low tune. She sat up, startled, and found him rocking Clara near the hearth, the tune old and full of ache. He saw her watching. "My mother sang this," he said. "She's still alive." "No, not for a long time." Maribeth stood, walked to him. She touched Clara's back, then rested her cheek against his shoulder. "She'd be proud." He swallowed hard. "I don't know if I deserve any of this." She turned him to face her. "You do. You've earned it every day you've stayed." Clay looked at her, eyes wide with something almost like fear. "I love you," he said, the words pulled from somewhere deep, untouched by time or regret. Maribeth didn't pause. "I know," she said. "I've known since you said my name on that porch." He kissed her then, not hurried or desperate, but slow, steady, like a man who had waited a long time and wasn't about to waste a second more. The wind outside raged, but inside the cabin held steady. The snow thawed in the final week of March. It didn't melt all at once like some great surrender, but dripped slowly from the eaves, from the pine boughs, from the rusted hinges of the shed door that had gone unopened since the first frost. Icicles gave way to rivulets, and the wind began to carry the scent of earth again, wet, rich, and full of things ready to live. Maribeth stood barefoot on the porch one morning, Clara tucked close to her chest, watching as the world reshaped itself. The air still carried a chill, but it was no longer cruel. Beside her, Joanna chased Matthew down the slope behind the house, their laughter ringing like it hadn't since Kansas, like it had been waiting all this time for spring. Inside, Clay sat at the table mending a torn strap on one of Joanna's boots, his brow furrowed in concentration. He'd taken to fixing things the way some men pray, quiet, with reverence. After the long winter, the house bore the signs of their survival: scratches on the floor from the rocking chair, scorch marks near the hearth from a night the fire got out of hand, scrawled chalk lines on the back wall where Matthew measured his height every few weeks and always forgot to erase the old marks. That afternoon, Maribeth found Clay down by the creek, rolling up fencing wire he'd salvaged from the collapsed pen that once held goats, years before either of them had set foot near the cabin. He looked up at her, eyes squinting against the sunlight, and smiled. It was a rare thing still, that smile, but it no longer felt like something borrowed. "You thinking of keeping livestock?" she asked, crossing her arms, Clara snoozing against her shoulder. "Thinking about what comes next," he said. Maribeth tilted her head. "What does that look like?" Clay hesitated, his eyes dropping to the bundle in her arms. "I've lived a long time waiting for something to break. Fences, people, promises. But this, He gestured toward the house, the land, the sound of children's laughter echoing from the hill. "This is the first thing I don't want to lose." Maribeth said nothing for a long moment, then stepped forward, her free hand brushing his arm. "Then don't." The thaw brought more than warmth. It brought noise. Travelers passed through the valley now, some on horseback, some with wagons burdened by supplies or people or silence. Most didn't stop. A few did, asking for water or directions or something warmer than what they'd left behind. Clay handled them with the same quiet watchfulness he'd given Maribeth that first day, always keeping one hand near his belt, always scanning the horizon even when his back was turned. One man stayed too long. Late one evening, as Maribeth was lighting the lanterns and the children sat around the hearth telling stories Joanna had half invented, Clay opened the door to find a tall figure standing just off the porch. He didn't wear a coat, only a battered vest and a thin wool shirt soaked through with rain. His boots were worn to the stitching, and he had a revolver on one hip that wasn't tied down. Maribeth stepped forward when she saw Clay tense, but he raised a hand gently, stopping her. "Even in," the stranger said, voice low and rasped like gravel. "Was looking for a man they used to call Maddox. Thought he might have come through here." Maribeth stiffened. Clay didn't move. "No Maddox here," he said. The man's eyes flicked past him toward the firelight. "You sure? He used to run with Emmett Finch. They say he's gone straight now, living like a family man, but some debts don't vanish in the snow." Clay stepped out onto the porch. "That's old business, and it's done." The stranger shrugged. "Thing is, I ain't got a family, so I got time." Maribeth held her breath, Clara stirring against her chest. Joanna stood behind the table, a hand on Matthew's shoulder. Clay stared the man down, then said calmly, "You'll turn around and walk away, because if you come back I won't give you the chance to knock." The man smiled, a slow, thin curve that didn't reach his eyes. Then he turned and walked back into the night, leaving nothing but his threat in the mud. That night Clay sat up late by the fire, his rifle across his knees, watching the flames but seeing something far beyond them. Maribeth didn't interrupt. She only brought him a blanket, kissed the top of his head, and went back to bed with Clara curled at her side. The next morning the children found a rabbit snared in one of Clay's old traps, and for the first time since the fight, Matthew insisted on helping clean it. Maribeth watched from the porch, baby in her arms, as the boy knelt beside Clay, asking a million questions and never once flinching at the answers. They cooked the rabbit over open flame that night, the smell drifting through the valley like a promise of permanence. After dinner, as the sun dipped low and the last light caught the edges of the melting snow, Maribeth and Clay sat beside the fire, Clara asleep in her arms. "I want to stay," she said suddenly. "I want this to be home." Clay looked at her, brows furrowed. "It already is." "No," she said softly. "I mean I want to build it, not just stay in someone else's cabin. I want it to be ours." Clay was quiet a long time. Then he nodded. "Spring's coming. We'll build something better." And they did. In the weeks that followed, they tore down the rotten shed and stacked what wood they could salvage. Clay marked out beams and support lines, and Maribeth helped mix mortar with her bare hands. Joanna carried nails in an old tin, and Matthew painted the walls with pine tar to keep the damp out. They worked side by side, sweat mixing with laughter, exhaustion folding into purpose. But always, the memory of that stranger lingered. Maribeth noticed Clay watching the ridge more often, noticed how his right hand twitched toward his hip at odd times, how he started sleeping closer to the door again. One evening, when the stars were thick and the wind carried no threat, she touched his shoulder and said, "We can leave if we need to." He turned to her. "I won't run any more, but I'll keep you safe." "I know," she whispered. That night she lay awake long after the children had gone quiet, tracing circles on Clara's back and listening to the rise and fall of Clay's breathing beside her. And for the first time she began to pray, not for escape, not for survival, but for a future. A real one. One where Clara grew tall, where Matthew learned to hunt, where Joanna smiled more often than not, where Clay's past couldn't find them, where home was something no one could steal. But prayers, she knew, didn't always arrive in silence. Sometimes they came with hooves on gravel, with the smell of sulfur, with gunfire slicing through dawn. It began 3 days later. The children were outside gathering wild onions when Clay stepped onto the porch and stopped dead. Maribeth followed his gaze and saw it, a glint of metal on the far ridge, just a flash like a signal. Then another, 2 riders, maybe more behind them. He moved fast, inside now. Maribeth didn't ask questions. She gathered the children, her voice steady even as her pulse raced. Clay locked the door and pulled the rifle from behind the stove, then handed her the pistol he'd kept buried under the floorboards. "They're here for me," he said, "but they'll come through you to get it." "We're not going to let that happen," she replied. He nodded, eyes hard. "You remember how to shoot." "I remember enough." He looked at her a long time then, like he was memorizing her. Then he kissed her deep, sure, no fear behind it, and turned back toward the door. The riders crested the hill, just as the sky began to lighten with dawn. And this time there would be no running. The riders came slow down the ridge like they had all the time in the world. They were 3 now, 2 out front, lean and long like wolves who'd tasted blood and found it worth remembering, and one behind, cloaked in a duster with a wide-brimmed hat drawn low. The third rode easy, reins loose, but there was something about the way his horse kept its head straight, trained like a soldier's steed, that made Clay stiffen. Maribeth watched from the dark edge of the window, pistol cradled in her palm, not trembling. Clara slept in her cradle, swaddled tight, unaware that the air had shifted and the ground beneath them now waited for blood. Joanna sat beside the hearth with Matthew huddled into her side, both of them silent, still as stone. It was not the silence of fear. It was obedience, trust. They had seen what Clay could do and what Maribeth could become, and that was enough. Clay stood on the porch when they reached the clearing. He'd chosen the spot where the light would be at his back, casting his figure tall, wide, and unreadable. A smart man didn't draw too early. A smart man waited for the wind to pick a side. The lead rider, a man with cheeks hollowed by hunger or habit, drew back his horse. "Been a long while, Maddox." Clay didn't blink. "That name's dead." "Maybe so, but ghosts got a funny way of walking." Behind him, the second man leaned forward in the saddle, squinting at the cabin. "Heard tell you bought yourself a family, or maybe they bought you." The man in the duster still hadn't spoken. Clay lowered one hand toward the rail but didn't touch the rifle resting nearby. "You've made your point. What now?" The hollow-cheeked man grinned. "What now? Reckon we settle what you left unsettled. Emmett Finch's gold. You walked off with the lion's share and left the rest of us for dead." "I left you alive," Clay said, voice hard. "That was your mercy." "And you think mercy buys silence?" "No," Clay replied, "but I think bullets still cost the same." The man in the duster finally dismounted. He moved slow, deliberate. His face was mostly shadow, but as he stepped into the light, Maribeth saw the jawline, scarred and cracked like weathered wood, and the eyes, pale blue and too quiet. "You don't remember me, do you?" the man asked, voice thin, reedy. "But I remember you. I remember watching you shoot my brother in the gut outside of Red Hollow and leaving him to scream in the dirt." Clay's voice didn't waver. "If I shot him, he gave me reason." "He was 16. Clay's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. The man smiled. "I've been waiting 10 years to see you bleed, so here we are." Maribeth moved then, silent across the cabin floor. She pressed a kiss to Clara's forehead, whispered something only a mother would know, then crouched beside the door and clicked the pistol's hammer back with the softest sound the world had ever heard. Outside, the first man reached for his holster. Clay didn't wait. His rifle cracked once, and the hollow-cheeked man flew backward off his saddle like a sack of grain. Before the others could react, Clay dropped to a knee, levered the rifle, and fired again. The second man's shoulder exploded in red, and he toppled with a cry, writhing in the grass. But the man in the duster didn't flinch. He moved forward, drawing his revolver slow, steady. "You always were fast," he said, "but I'm not here for a duel." He fired, not at Clay, but at the cabin. The shot punched through the side wall, splintering wood inches from where Maribeth crouched. She flinched but didn't fall back. Instead, she rose in a smooth motion, opened the door with her free hand and fired twice. The first shot went wide. The second caught the duster man in the leg. He screamed and went down, gun skittering away. Clay was already moving. He bounded off the porch and crossed the distance in seconds, boot slamming down on the revolver before the man could reach it. "Go ahead," the man panted. "Kill me, you've done worse." Clay stood over him, rifle in hand, finger on the trigger, but he didn't fire. "I didn't come here to be the man I was," he said, "but you came looking for him." From the cabin, Maribeth stepped out, gun still raised. "He threatened our home." Clay looked down one last time, then turned. "Get off this land. Crawl if you have to. If I ever see you again, I won't hesitate." The man spat blood but didn't argue. Clay didn't wait for him to start moving. The second rider was still breathing, clutching his ruined shoulder. Maribeth stood over him for a moment, gun in hand, then looked toward Clay. "What now?" she asked. Clay met her eyes. "We bury the first, send the others back broken." She nodded once. It was Joanna who stepped out next, holding her little brother's hand, both of them staring wide-eyed at the field of men and blood. Maribeth crouched beside them. "It's over now." "Will they come back?" Joanna asked. Maribeth looked at Clay, and he shook his head. "No," she said, "not again." They buried the man Clay had killed on the edge of the woods, far from the house. Not near the other graves. Those were reserved for kin. There were no words said, no markers left. Only silence and the soft sound of shovels in wet soil. Afterward, Clay stood by the stream, washing the blood from his hands, the rifle beside him. Maribeth joined him, arms crossed against the wind. "That was the last of it," he said. "Every man who could come after me is either dead or broken. Then it's really over." Clay turned to her, his face open in a way it rarely was. "Do you believe I deserve peace?" Maribeth reached up, brushing a thumb along his cheek. "You've earned it." The next day they packed the children and Clara into the wagon and rode down to town. Not the old town. This was farther south, where the road widened and the trees thinned, and a proper store stood with real glass windows. Maribeth bought fabric for dresses, nails for the new barn, sugar for spring pies, and a red ribbon for Joanna, who beamed so brightly it felt like summer had come early. Clay stood near the post, watching her as she counted coins and bartered like she'd never been desperate. When she looked back at him, he didn't look away. That night they sat on the porch again, fireflies blinking in the tall grass, Clara asleep in her arms, the children inside making noise enough for 10. "I never told you why I said your name that first day," he said quietly. Maribeth looked at him, the memory like smoke behind her eyes. "Why did you?" Clay turned, something like awe in his face. "Because I'd heard it in a dream, years ago, after the war. I was laying in a field half dead and I heard a woman say my name, real soft like a prayer. And then she said hers, Maribeth." She blinked, stunned. "I thought I imagined it, until I saw you standing there with those children, looking at me like you knew I wouldn't hurt you." "I didn't know that," she whispered. "Not really." "You did," he said. "You just forgot." Maribeth leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. "Then I guess we were meant to remember together." They stayed that way a long time, until the stars thickened and the land quieted and the world settled back into itself. The cabin behind them was no longer just shelter. It was memory, promise, proof. And in the stillness, beneath the hum of insects and the hush of wind, Maribeth whispered one last prayer. But this time it wasn't a plea. It was thanks. Spring came with its usual stubbornness, slow and uncertain, as if the land itself had grown cautious after so many hard winters. The snow melted in patches, revealing muddy earth and shoots of green like soft-spoken promises. The trees bore buds, the air warmed, and each morning brought birdsong louder than the last. But it wasn't just the weather that was changing. It was the rhythm of their lives, shifting like soil stirred after years of stillness. Maribeth rose early now, not from necessity or fear, but out of choice. Clara stirred beside her in the cradle, cheeks rosy with sleep, and Maribeth would pause for a quiet moment before slipping out from under the quilt, pulling her shawl tight and stepping outside into the cool morning air. There she would find Clay already at work, stacking chopped wood, checking the fencing, or mending the barn's sagging door. He wasn't the same man who had stood in shadow that first night, silent and unreadable. The mountain man had softened, not in strength but in presence. His eyes still held that glacier-gray stillness, but they watched her now, not just the horizon. He spoke more too, not much, but enough to fill the spaces that once throbbed with silence. He laughed sometimes, and when he smiled it was like watching thawed earth turn to bloom. The children had changed as well. Joanna, whose shoulders had once carried burdens too old for her, now laughed freely. She climbed trees, helped Clay tie new fishing lines, and sometimes even forgot to look over her shoulder. Matthew spoke again, more than he ever had before. His voice was high and curious, always asking questions about birds, clouds, how fire worked, and why trees slept in winter. He'd taken to following Clay like a shadow, mimicking how he walked, how he held tools, even how he frowned when something didn't work right. And then there was Maribeth. She too was different, not rebuilt but reborn. Her grief hadn't vanished, it had simply moved aside, making room for other things. She wore her wedding band on a string now, kept close but no longer clutched like a lifeline. Her back stood straighter, her voice steadier, and though the pain of loss still lingered at the edges, it no longer steered her steps. Love had not replaced grief, it had simply walked beside it. One morning she found Clay standing at the edge of the garden they'd begun carving from the thawed earth, eyes fixed on the trees beyond. He held something in his hand, an old envelope, yellowed and folded twice over. She touched his elbow. "What's that?" Clay didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "It's from years ago, before I came here. Letter from a man I rode with once. Said if I ever wanted to lay down the past, I should find a place where no one knew my name." She glanced at the letter, then at him. "And did you?" He nodded. "I tried, but the past followed, always does." "Maybe," she said gently, "but you didn't run from it when it found you. You stood your ground, you protected us." "I killed a man," Clay said, jaw tightening. "You saved a family," she corrected. "That's what I'll remember. That's what the children will remember." He turned then, slowly, and looked at her in that way he did when words weren't enough. "I never thought I'd be part of something again." "You didn't become part of something," Maribeth said. "You became everything." He held her then, out in the open, arms wrapped around her with a kind of reverence. And she leaned into him, her face pressed to his chest, listening to the steady thrum of a heart that had once known nothing but war and wilderness, now beating steady in the rhythm of a home. That evening, Joanna and Matthew helped plant the first rows of potatoes while Clay turned soil for tomatoes. Clara gurgled on a blanket under the porch's shade, chubby fists batting at air as if catching invisible joy. Maribeth washed linens and hung them on the line, her dress billowing in the breeze, her smile soft and real. Later, after supper, cornbread stew and the first apple pie of the season, they sat around the fire. Clay carved a little wooden horse for Matthew, his hands deft and sure. Joanna read aloud from a tattered book, her voice halting but determined. Maribeth nursed Clara, humming under her breath. It wasn't grand. It wasn't perfect, but it was life, honest and earned. That night, after the children had been tucked in and the fire burned low, Clay and Maribeth sat on the porch again, a habit now as natural as breath. The stars were thick overhead, the sky deep and endless. He turned to her. "I've been thinking." She smiled, dangerous. He chuckled low. "Maybe, but I think this land's got more to offer than just shelter. We could build more. Maybe add another room, get a few animals, chickens, a milk cow, maybe even open the trail for passers-by come winter." She raised an eyebrow. "You want strangers near?" He shrugged. "Not all strangers stay strangers. Some come looking for shelter and end up family." Maribeth's eyes shimmered. "You want a life here?" "I want one with you," he said, voice firm. She reached for his hand. "Then we build it together." He leaned down and kissed her, soft, sure, not with urgency but with promise. It was a kiss that said he'd stay, that the past had no claim on the future they were forging, that this woman, this porch, these children, this land, they were his now. The days passed. The house grew louder with laughter. The land greened and bore fruit. And by the time summer crested, there was talk of marriage, not with white dresses or preachers, but with hands held across a table and promises whispered under stars. Clay fashioned a ring from old silver, shaped it himself by firelight, polished it until it caught the sun like it was made of light. When he slipped it on her finger, she wept, not from sadness, but from the kind of joy that has no words, only breath and trembling hands. And so it was that the woman who had walked into the wilderness with 2 children and a womb full of sorrow found not just safety, not just survival, but a kind of grace, a redemption forged in fire and softened by love. The man she bought for $1 had cost her nothing, and yet given her everything. And though the wind still howled through the trees some nights, and shadows sometimes stirred just beyond the light, there was always the sound of a baby cooing, a boy laughing, a girl singing, and 2 voices, low, steady, intertwined, building a future from the ashes of what once was. They were not just a woman and a man anymore. They were a home, a family, a story worth remembering. Summer deepened its roots across the valley, and with each passing day, the old fears seemed smaller, less sharp. Life wasn't perfect. Maribeth still woke some nights with her heart thudding from dreams she couldn't quite remember, and Clay still kept the rifle by the door out of habit more than necessity. But the cabin no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like a beginning. They built a henhouse together, laughing when the first chickens refused to stay inside. Matthew made a game of chasing them back, and Joanna became the self-appointed egg collector, beaming each morning as if discovering treasure. Clay expanded the small barn, working alongside Maribeth when she wasn't tending the baby. He carved her a rocking chair for the porch, smooth as river stone, and she spent many evenings there with Clara in her arms, humming softly as the sky turned orange and gold. One afternoon, a rider came up the trail, a woman in a broad hat, saddle worn, her horse dusty from travel. Clay stiffened at the sight, his instincts bristling, but the woman raised a hand in greeting. Name S. Lorna, passed through 10 years back. I remember this cabin. Maribeth met her on the porch. It's ours now. Lorna smiled. I can see that. Looks different, better. They shared coffee and talk under the eaves while Clay kept watch from the corner. Lorna spoke of trails reopened, a nearby town growing fast, even whispers of a new rail line miles south. But what caught Maribeth's ear was when she leaned in and said, folks out there are looking for good places. Safe ones. A woman like you with land and strength. You could be more than just a home. You could be a haven. After Lorna left, her words lingered. Clay found Maribeth at the table later, staring at a map, brows drawn. You thinkin' of talkin' folks in? She nodded slowly. Not all at once, but maybe one at a time. Women like I was with little ones, nowhere to go. He pulled out a chair, sat beside her and placed a hand over hers. Then we'll build more rooms. That night she wrote her first letter since coming to the mountains. It was short, a few lines, sent with Lorna when she passed back through. It read, if you know a mother with nothing left but the will to try again, send her north. There's room here. There's hope. By autumn, another woman arrived, young, skittish, carrying a toddler on her hip. Maribeth welcomed her with bread still warm from the oven, and Clay repaired the old shed into a second home. More would come. The mountains would echo with more than wind. And in time, the trail that once led to nowhere would become something more, a lifeline. A place where sorrow met healing. A place where broken things were mended. A place where a pregnant widow bought a mountain man for $1 and built a legacy that couldn't be priced.